All right. Well, thanks for joining us for our conversation with Joel Kotkin, who I'm going to call, I'm going to broadly categorize you, Joel, as a author and commentator, among many other things. Joel's most recent book is The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class, newly out, I think, Joel, in paperback from Encounter Books. He is also the Roger Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University, executive director of the Urban Reform Institute in Houston, and executive editor of a great website, newgeography.com. And he writes in many other places as well, including recently, though I don't think most recently, for the Giving Review Symposium on what we called Conservatism and the Future of Tax-Incentivized Big Philanthropy. Now, Joel does not put himself in the category of conservatives. He's we'll let him tell you what he is. It might be a social, but the title of Joel's piece was the nonprofit threat.
Right.
Okay, Joel, what's the nonprofit threat?
Well, again, if we start from the point of view that I'm not a conservative in the sense that I don't think concentrations of capital is a not important issue. I think concentration of capital is maybe the most important issue. The ability of a relatively small number of people to pour billions of dollars into what are really quasi-political efforts is really the characteristic of this age. When we think about the amount of money, let's just take some cases. I mean, Jeff Bezos can give $10 billion to green causes, which just, here's a guy who's shooting his girlfriend into space. This is somebody who's built one of the biggest yachts ever built. This is somebody with incredible numbers of houses, and he's supporting groups who want to impose austerity on the working class. It just seems to me unbelievable. But as bad as Jeff's situation is, at least Jeff, he earned his money, and he's a very smart guy. I've met him. But what about his discarded ex-wife? What about Gates' discarded ex-wife, or Lorraine Jobs? Obviously, she's a widow. These people have tens of billions of dollars. We've never seen that sort of money that quickly. And these are young people. These are not, so I always say to people, you know what, we're going to be living with the Chan Zuckerberg connection for the rest of our lives. These people have endless amounts of money. And then you've had I would say you almost have to say the subvention or maybe the subjugation of some of the old foundations, MacArthur, Ford, Rockefeller, which were founded by people who were generally pretty horrible far-right people in many ways. MacArthur certainly was. Ford and Rockefeller, you certainly wouldn't associate them with social democracy. And yet those institutions have also been completely taken over. The Irvine Foundation, which I've many years ago we supported. I was doing a study on the evolution of business leadership in LA. Now the Irvine Foundation is an ultra-liberal foundation in San Francisco. Did everyone ever hear of Irvine in San Francisco? I mean, so what you've got is a common culture of kind of progressive, very often highly educated, politically motivated people, all of whom sign on to essentially the same agenda. Whereas the conservatives, in some ways I kind of like it, they fight with each other. They're, they tend to be kind of individualistic and are open to debate. I mean, that's what's really interesting to me is that, I mean, people like me or Roy Teixeira or Max Taibbi or Barry Weiss or Andrew Sullivan, all of whom come from the left, have no place else to go but to the right, because this institutional money has also taken over the media. I mean, if you think about it, you have these ultra green foundations paying for the climate coverage of AP and NPR. I mean, this is unbelievable. It's like I compare it to like the idea that you could that if Occidental Petroleum paid for the climate coverage in the Houston Chronicle, I don't think people would take it too seriously as being objective.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet we take people with a very profound ideological take, and they fund the newspapers. I mean, this is one of the biggest frustrations I have is the inability to have a decent debate about almost any issue, because the preponderance of money and the preponderance of media control. I mean, obviously Bezos owns the Washington Post. I mean, the tech oligarchs through the control of advertising are basically, well over the established newspapers. I mean, you have organizations like, Comcast, Netflix, all with the same ideology. I mean, it's just the only thing that will save us, at least, is maybe some of these rich people are going to realize that they really don't want a future where their heads are in a guillotine. But, I don't think they know enough history to know that, when you keep pushing this thing, I mean, because, like, for instance, take on green issues. Why should, if I'm a really serious environmental activist, why am I comfortable with people who go to Davos in private jets, or who own 6 houses, who who will brag about their collections of old cars, or you can take anything. John Kerry goes, flies in his private jet to a resort in the Caribbean. How, if I'm a serious green, like, take somebody like Barry Commoner. I mean, you could disagree with what Commoner's saying, but he was saying you can't have this and that at the same time. That if you fundamentally think that the system is destroying the planet, then you can't really be aligned with the people who control the system. So ultimately, I think there will be a coming a coming conflict between this sort of philanthropical progressivism and what I would call real progressivism. I don't necessarily agree with everything they're saying, but Amazon is not a great place for the working class. These companies are almost all non-union. They will ship any job they can either to a foreign country or like in the case of Silicon Valley, 75% of the workforce is foreign born.
So, Joel, when you talk about real progressivism, standing in opposition to establishment, big philanthropy,
right.
their version of, might there be allies with you on some of that among populist conservatives like JD?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the most exciting potential developments in America, and which the philanthropic community will do everything it can to prevent in most cases, with the exception maybe of, American Compass and, some relatively small groups, is this growing convergence between, in a funny way, you could say, the Bernie Sanders left and the populist right. There are a series of issues in which there is fairly broad agreement that we need to have a very different direction.
And philanthropy, the I guess what I mean is the tax status of much, though not all, of philanthropy might be among those
right. Well, I think that there has to be some limit to what, I mean, really, if someone like Bezos or Zuckerberg wants to put, $20 billion into a nonprofit that does all sorts of things, do we really think that should be tax advantaged at that point? I mean, I understand. I'm not talking about taxing, the family foundation that has, $50 million. That's, every city needs people like that. And I don't have to agree with what they're doing, but, that's fine. But we're talking about a scale of wealth. And this brings out my old, if you will, social democratic worldview. when you have this kind of wealth, we're not talking about a few, $20 million, $50 million. You're talking about billions of dollars, and you're talking about control of the means of communication. That's why recently I've been writing about the fact that there has to be something between the domination of the state and the domination of the large corporations. The problem with the conservatives, if I may, is that they don't understand this at all. I mean, particularly I would say your standard brand, libertarian conservative just doesn't get it. I read things like from Phil Graham. Well, actually, inequality is not that bad because look at all the transfer payments. Don't you get it? Transfer payments are a form of servitude. If you are dependent throughout your life on government payment so that you're not going to fall into poverty, which I understand, but it's not like owning a house, owning a business, having a career where you can take care of yourself. I mean, and I think it's particularly poor with the libertarian part of the Republican Party, but also in the country club people, which is basically that the basis of conservatism has to be the dispersion of property ownership. And if property ownership is concentrated, like if you look at the things that are pushed by some of the free market so-called groups, all it means is more and more power in smaller and smaller hands. I mean, I see conservatives funding here in California efforts to destroy single-family zoning in the name of the market, even though they don't say anything about the fact that you can't build in most of the state because of climate regulations. And you can't, so I think that conservatives are all too often useful idiots of the progressives.
Yeah. But yet, well, is there a timeline on a potential or when such an alliance or overlap might yield a policy application?
Well, my hope is that whether it's, DeSantis, Youngkin, Haley, whoever, that the Republicans manage to nominate a human being for president, which of course may be more than you can ask for, and that people begin to realize that many of the policies, not all, but many of the policies that Trump passed were actually fairly decent policies. They have to be disassociated from a moral reprobate, which is what he is. Okay. I have no patience for conservatives who make excuses for Donald Trump, because if Gavin Newsom did all the same things, they'd be all over it, and rightfully so. Gavin Newsom is not, he's not the most attractive character in history, but he's not Donald Trump, and so I think that if you got a decent Republican candidate, I think you would see something like what happened. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember when Reagan became president. I covered Reagan for the Washington Post. Under the tutelage of Lou Cannon, who was one of the great straight-ahead reporters that we don't have anymore, at least not many of them. But when Reagan became president, there were many people who had been liberals all their lives, who, for one reason or the other, I don't necessarily have to agree with them, but they moved over into the Republican Party because they felt the Democrats had gone, during the McGovern period, they had gone too far to the left and taking positions they didn't like.
And Reagan appealed to them. He appealed purposely, consciously, maybe politically, to the working class.
And also that he was also able to, and I think a lot of it is, because Reagan was in Hollywood, he had been head of a union. He, in terms of, particularly in terms of people that he knew personally. I happened to have done the Reagan cover for Esquire in 1980. And you know what? He had lots of gay friends. He had a lot of Jewish friends. He came out of Hollywood. And, you could be in those days, you could be a conservative in Hollywood and still go to the right cocktail parties. I don't think that happens now.
Well, that's a thing. That's not irrelevant. It's harder to be a Reagan now. That's a question. But I guess
Right.
who's Reagan now? Vance? I mean, who's in terms of appealing to the middle class? But Vance as well, I guess he had a Hollywood. There was a movie, right? But
Well, the problem with JD, and who I know and I respect, is he's decided to hitch himself to Trump, and I think it's an enormous
yeah,
mistake.
yeah,
Because I think he's got the intellectual capacity to be a key bridge figure, and I think he no necessity to endorse Trump at this stage of the game, and I think he's, I don't know whether whether there's something we don't know, but it is really sad. But there is certainly a growing sense that this combination of enormous money with a particular political agenda, which, by the way, I think is terrible for the middle and working classes. I mean, the future that's being proposed is essentially, electric cars are just a screen for getting rid of cars. They're the most recent stuff out of California. They're saying, and California is what amounts for a brain for the Biden administration. Is a future where everybody lives in little apartments. Most people don't drive. Of course, the wealthy will have cars. In a lot of ways, it's a regressive agenda to bring us back to the realities of 1890, where only a relatively small number of people, particularly in urban areas, owned homes. Or even, let's say, to 1920, where a very small group of people owned cars. I think we're regressing, and it's a regressive agenda, but it's considered progressive. and I think there is this a lot of dissent, not just among conservatives about this, but also among many liberals who can see it. Every day you turn on your computer, you have no choice, pretty much. You either have to have Apple or Microsoft. And Microsoft can screw around with the programming to their heart's content because they don't give a crap. Because you know what? You got no place else to go. And that's the kind of society that is creating what my friend Mike Lynn calls the toll booth economy, where every time you do something, you pay for it. And I think that there's a lot of potential dissent. I don't know whether DeSantis is the right answer or Youngkin. I wish there was a Democrat of the Bill Clinton type who would maybe try to transcend it. I voted for Clinton twice. But I don't see a Bill Clinton out there. I don't see anyone with the cojones to take on the crazy woke agenda. I don't see, take on the crazy prosecutors, take on, CRT, take on the fact that, thank God for my university isn't there yet anyway, but, making people sign DEI statements before they can get a promotion, or, that kind of insanity, deciding that merit is not important. But let's say law is a bullshit profession anyway. So, okay, you could put up with a little bit of crap there. Medicine, airline pilots, you're going to do that by preference. I don't want to get on that plane, and I don't want to get on that operating table. And you're talking to a guy whose two primary doctors, one is Indian, the other one's Korean. So it has nothing to do with white racism, even though I'm actually the son of a medical school professor from New York. But it's the ripping away the idea of merit, but the great irony is that many of these fortunes are based on merit and on really hard work, and yet the policies that are being promoted are against merit, against hard work, not interested in people's aspirations to own a house, own a business, raise a family. And I think that we're, in a lot of ways, it's sort of a very much an anti-human worldview, if I could put it that way. Mm-hmm. They think of human beings as an impediment. And what they want is a situation where, if I hear one more thing, democracy dies in the darkness. Democracy dies when Jeff Bezos has too much money.
Okay.
Um, I mean,
Including in his philanthropy.
right, and then he has so much money that he. I mean, these people could would support look at the money that went to Black Lives Matter, which anybody who knew anything knew that these were a bunch of very far left and somewhat corruptible people. We all know this now, but they were giving them hundreds of millions of dollars were raised for groups like Black Lives Matter or for groups like them. How could that possibly fit into the agenda of achievement oriented tech oligarchs?
Mm-hmm. I guess if I was going to ask you again, which I kind of want to do, whether they're on the timeline, when might there be an alliance between when, or at least, when will they talk to each other? Progressives and populist conservatives. I guess populist progressives on the left, conservative populists on the right.
There's been some. I mean, the difficulty today is if you're someone like who goes on the other side, you just become a non-person. What in the Soviet Union they used to call a former person. Like I'll sometimes read something. I said, well, I wrote that article 10 years ago. Didn't anybody pay attention? Because the problem is like facts that have come out, like people moving to suburbs, people moving to Sunbelt cities, and massive movements. They were denied. Now they finally acknowledge it, but they have a hard time acknowledging why it's happening. And the reality is there is now growing contact. I mean, when you have an Andrew Sullivan or a Matt Taibbi or Roy Teixeira writing stuff and publishing in conservative outlets, that's the beginning. I think the fact that you have Republican senators who are pro-labor now, you didn't have that before. So I think that there's room for some changes. I think on the on the attempts to impose antitrust laws, that's a clear one where the free market conservatives never met a big capitalist they didn't like. I mean, they cannot divorce themselves from their ideology, which is money is good and the more money is better, and without thinking about, well, what does that do to society, and why does somebody have so much money? Well, don't they in part have a lot of money because they have monopolistic control? If I have 90% of the operating systems, if I have 90% of search, I can make money ad infinitum. And so there's a growing group of people on the left and on the right who understand that this is not working. And the conversations have begun. The question is, will there be a Reagan-like character who will bring people in? And by the way, I would twist it the other way. You get a Bill Clinton who attracts Republicans because he would denounce Sister Soldier. He would, he supported many reforms that, let's say on welfare that conservatives had been pushing for. We need a Clinton or a Reagan. Those are the two great politicians that I've seen in my lifetime. And we need somebody like that. And I don't know if there is somebody like that or not.
Yeah. Well, okay, Joel Kotkin, why don't we end it there? Thank you so much for, contributing to the symposium with the.
Well, I'm really glad.